Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. Again, we have an honored guest here from the University of Washington, and we're always so pleased when they're able to come across the water. It's such a great resource that we have here at Microsoft to be close to such a wonderful university, and we do thank the University of Washington for taking the time to work with us and share some of its very interesting research with us. Our guest today is Professor Leroy Searle, who received his PhD in English at the University of Rochester, and he taught there and at the SUNY Visual Studies Workshop, and is now Professor of English at the University of Washington. He was the founding director of the Humanities and Arts Computing Center at the UW, and was also director of the UW Simpson Center for the Humanities. He's been a Novell network engineer for years and has written more lines of assembly code than I think probably all of us in this room put together. So please help me welcome Professor Leroy Searle.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects today, something that comes up in almost every class I teach, the problem of metaphor. And I've given it a title that initially I thought was a little bit misleading, but why should I not give this title anyway? Because metaphor, when it's treated as a logical problem, is devious. It's not only devious, it's sometimes positively deviant. And there is a long history intellectually, of philosophers being very upset and worried about metaphor. In Aristotle's Poetics, he says that the most important thing for being a poet is the capacity to handle metaphor. But he finds metaphor extremely problematic because it's so hard to figure out what they mean. In later iterations of this problem, where metaphor as a logical instrument is regarded as difficult, if not downright objectionable, begins with John Locke, who says that metaphor is only a device to mislead and poison the mind, and that it ought to be suppressed altogether. Now the fact that we have that. He did not. He did not. His mind was altogether too much, the tabula rasa. But I had several years ago a student who had taken an undergraduate degree in philosophy and took a course from me where we spent a lot of time working with metaphors. And he decided that he wanted to do his master's thesis on the philosophical problem of metaphor. And I cautioned him. I said, David, please don't do this. I might not see you, for several years. And that turned out to be exactly the problem, because it becomes unmanageable. Now, part of what has interested me about the study of metaphor, is that most of the approaches taken to it formally by linguists, by logicians, by people looking at problems of knowledge representation, are primarily an encounter with things that we ourselves can do that turn out to be very surprising and difficult to try to explain. Now, starting from what I do with metaphor as a teacher of English, even though I am kind of a utility infielder within the department, when I first became an English major was after having an undergraduate instructor say, the greatest thing about being an English major is that after you have read Paradise Lost and Thanatopsis, anything in print is fair game. And I took him absolutely at his word. But what in the study of literature, the metaphor becomes, is an instrument of relation. And it is so powerful, so flexible, that it turns out to be the one thing that students need to address if they're going to understand what a poem means. Because when looking at metaphorical constructions, there are several types this is not meant on this slide as anything resembling a formal taxonomy. This is just a convenient way of thinking about some of the things that metaphors do. The first type that I want to talk about is attribute matching. In the case of a very well-known simile, my love is like a red, red rose that's lately sprung in June. My love is like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. And treating it as an instrument of relation, the issue of attributes, which I will treat here informally, is that when somebody says, my love is like a red, red rose, if someone were to say, now let me think about that, does that mean that my love is vegetative, has thorns, is seasonally afflicted by aphids? And usually people will say, no, that's not what I meant. So that if you actually look at the relation that's established between my love and a red, red rose, you're looking for a relation between those two things where there will be attributes that match. The rose smells good and so does she. The rose looks good and so does she. The rose is beautiful and so is she. So that you're looking for a condition of appositeness in the metaphor. How many attributes will line up so that they match? Now, the fact that you could take the example, does my love is like a red, red rose mean my love is afflicted seasonally by aphids and has thorns? And you could, without even pushing irony very hard, say, you're damn right, that love does have thorns, and that it is seasonally afflicted by aphids, but now we have a metaphor packed within a metaphor, and that's typically what happens. It's why, when you treat it logically, you have to be prepared for these deviations. That you'll find that if you want to understand what does it mean to say that love has aphids, then you have to do attribute matching on aphids to connect it to all of the things that may be very bad consequences from love. A second is much more elaborate, and it's a lot harder to handle in formal terms. These are analogies and substitutions, where you will have two things that will be set up, analogically. So this is a line, here, the eye of heaven, from Shakespeare's sonnet, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And the eye of heaven, clearly is a metaphor because heaven doesn't have eyes. So that you have in the background of this an analogy between the eye and the face and the sun in heaven, and then you must make the connection to substitute one for the other. The problem with doing this formally is that you can end up with so many substitutions that it gets out of hand in a couple of steps. The third is one that this is my own term, and I'll have an example that we'll talk about this. Problematic intentionality. And I'm using this with the logical spelling of that word, not with a T, but with the S, to take into account the philosophical handling of distinctions between intention and extension. Where the intention of something is generally taken to be its meaning. But the problematic intentionality, and what I mean by that, is that there are many cases in which you may think you know the meaning of a particular word until you start looking at it in a construction. And then you discover that it has attributes and features semantically active that you hadn't expected, and that they show up in ways that then lead you to say, do I really know what a worm is? And we'll look at William Blake's poem, The Sick Rose. And the last is associational restriction, where you may have metaphors that will show up that you wouldn't initially even think that they were metaphors because they are not necessarily in that form of this object is like this, establishing some relation of appositeness. But they emerge, out of range of associations and expectations with certain words. They may be hinged on a verb, on a noun, on an adjective, on some conventional piece of usage, on syntax, where something happens that is not expected. That the restriction that is ordinarily there in the application of a word will suddenly throw you, because what the poet has done is to use a verb that you didn't expect to have in the context of a sentence. As, for example, in a poem of Emily Dickinson, where she's talking about a narrow fellow in the grass, and speaking of the narrow fellow as in the grass is where he occasionally rides. Now, the notion of somebody riding, if you have no wheels and no way to wheel, and nothing that's going to carry you, is an instance of metaphor that works in that way. Now, get to the next one. As you can see here with the example I used before from Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose that's lately sprung in June. My love is like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. Now, one very interesting thing about this is that if you look on just a kind of brief list of attributes that you might notionally be able to prepare, you could do an analysis of saying this metaphor works as a relational device by establishing the relation R between A and B. But what happens is that all of those extraneous or extravagant relations you might establish, such as thorns and aphids, they turn out to be something that you could indeed elaborate and follow out if you wanted to follow that deviation. So when the poem is constructed, one of the principal things of doing this kind of rather lightweight an analysis of underlying features is that what happens in this case is that the first metaphor, which leaves you, oops, sorry, that wasn't what I wanted it to do, which leaves these ambiguous possibilities still open. In what ways might my love be like a red, red rose? And if you have a wicked or comic bone in your body, you can find lots more than what I've listed here. But what Burns does here is a very typical strategy, and it happens more often than you would realize, that the first appearance of a metaphor is constrained by another appearance of a metaphor. So in the second case, my love's like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. So now you've compounded the problem. You have to put the melody in tune over here, and in a very simple illustration, you look for the ones that match all the way across. Is the melody fresh? We're not sure what a fresh melody would be, but it is beautiful, it is pleasing. And so the second metaphor will say, you've just gone out of bounds in all of the things that you did extravagantly in that first case. So the possibility this raises, and it's one that is worthy of very broad extension, is that the poem, when you look at the individual metaphors, becomes less an object about which to reason than it is an example of a primary form of reasoning itself. That when people use metaphors, it is not to mislead or poison the mind, it is instead to allow you a very specific exploration of features that are otherwise intractable, in ordinary language. So when one metaphor is used and another one follows it, that second metaphor serves as a constraint upon the first, meaning that you will know when you've gone wrong so that you stay on point. And it reinforces, as it were, that relation, as an argumentative device. So if you look at a literary text, not as something that is there for self-expression or just for a pretty ornamental language, but as a mode of reasoning, it is primary, and it's very powerful. So in this case, it's quite clear, that all of the things you might say about these metaphors could be entertaining. Some of them may lead you to interesting discoveries, but that's not where Robert Burns is going. And so an appropriate reading of this poem would curtail many of the things that show up in the interest of getting the entire picture of what this poem is about. What it is about is the lover about to leave, saying, I will come back though I have gone 10,000 miles. That raises other problems, because that's another metaphor. And every metaphor seems to give way to another one. But let's take a look at the next one. Now this is a very familiar poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now this is a case where the poem is done in a masterful way. There are discernible metaphors in every line, sometimes multiple ones, many of them that you might not even notice are metaphors. Because the comparison here has become what in literary history we would call a conceit. And so you might initially take this poem to be about, as in the Robert Burns poem, about my love. But it turns out to be a very interesting and quite serious argument about the writing of poetry itself. What gives love to the lover is the life of Shakespeare's sonnet. And the analogies and substitutions, this is just one. But in almost every line, you find things where there are analogies between things, and Shakespeare is then working with complex underlying relations between them. Now, I want to shift to the end, because otherwise we might not get to it. I spent some time in preparing for this looking at computer-generated poetry. Now, there was a time, many years ago, when people in artificial intelligence took this with a certain seriousness. And most of the early experiments of trying to get a computer to write poems were so bad and so wretched that you realize this is an extremely low form of entertainment. But there are some that show some rather interesting things. I'll just go all the way to the end of this to find it. I came upon this by Jonathan Partington, and it's quite wonderful. But what he did here is he uses the syntactical patterns of the lines and repeats those. You save the arrangement in such a way that the substitutions that the computer might make don't so completely throw you off, that some stochastic process has taken over completely. Now this one is really quite funny. Shall I compare thee to a noxious bed? Thou art more like a graceful squalid egg. For none will ever warmly call thee red, until my elk they see us choke a leg. My heart is crimson, likewise it is blue. Where'er I see the hopeless maidens growl, I stun the reckless butler, for a new had crudely whistled as it found a fowl. Alas, the days of android, blob, and pine are gone, and now the stainless scarecrows fume. Icelandic was the reindeer, now so fine, and vermin cannot heat the chuckling broom. But thou, my falling Gorgon, shall not write until we firmly stand at heaven's light. Now, in this case, there's no way you can make any mistake of seeing this as a form of reasoning. But you can see it as a form of fun, and that's fairly important. But here, even in a case like this, it's whatever algorithms you might devise to write poetry, you're still going to need a lot of help to keep it from degenerating into the kinds of things that I have in a large folder on my hard disk. Yes?
I'm just curious if someone tried giving this to, at least some set of poetry readers or critics and have them interpret, not tell them that it's a computer-generated poetry, whether they would find interesting things in it.
Well, there's a long practice of opening any book and putting your finger down and then holding forth on it. Among the Romans and the ancient Hebrews, the practice was done both with Virgil's Aeneid and with the Bible as a mode of fortune telling. But in the universities, we still actually do this. It's a cheap form of showing off. And part of the power of metaphor is that analytically, you could go through this and build up one hell of a case. But I don't think anyone would ever be fooled, to say this is something that was either done as a joke or it was done by a computer. Now, part of the problem here is that why this remains a subject of some interest. Is not that you'd expect to ever come to a point where computers would write poems, but what do you find out when you try to do it? how many things are there in that underlying logic that you otherwise would not have formalized specifically so as to be able to see. So that is, I guess that's a way of evading your question. But I think what would be involved is how much cleverness is the analyst brought to bear on it. And if you ever got to a point where it was close enough, the comparing examples would have to be people who are being deliberately funny, and usually wickedly funny, because otherwise the departure from ordinary patterns of the language and our expectations is just too great. Okay. Well, in any case, here this is it's interesting, but notice here that what you have in this case, is the syntactical patterns that the computer program has built it around preserve one element that allows us a kind of stability. And in all of these instances, metaphor as relational thinking does rely on that. Now, in this instance, the problematic intentionality, what I mean by that phrase, is that if one supposes the intention of a word can be understood as its meaning, as soon as you open that box, you discover it's much deeper and much wider, and at the risk of a very bad pun, it's full of worms. Now, this is a poem that is part of a large body of work by William Blake. It's 2 illustrated books, The Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which Blake presents as being poems that show the 2 contrary states of the human soul. Now, this poem does not really require its contrary. This is a poem of the state of experience, but it's quite remarkable because of the way the metaphors work in this instance. It depends on the fact that as soon as you start thinking relationally, you recognize just how problematic is your understanding of the meaning of a word. That there are ways that you can make discoveries that you wouldn't have even expected. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Now you can read that and just get a little bit of a chill. This is not a happy poem. But what does this mean? You look at the way Blake has set this up. He now has a rose that is presented as the primary subject of the poem. I don't know if on your version you can see that down here in the rose there is a female figure trying to escape from the rose. But the depiction in the illustration, you see this reclining figure up here. The rose is not standing upright, it's declined. It clearly is sick and dying. And to take a vegetable thing like a rose, this departs very far from what Robert Burns was doing. Is my love like a red, red rose? Well, it's quite possible that Blake may have known that little song of Robert Burns. They're contemporaries. But in this case, the rose, is presented as a kind of stand-in human agent with all of the attributes and qualities of a human agent. But now it's presented as this rose. Now, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy. Now, one of the common readings of this poem, and it just about always has to be pointed out to undergraduates, and then they think you're making it up, is that Blake is writing this poem right in the midst of the first very large and really deadly serious outbreak of syphilis, in the city of London. And they had no idea what they were dealing with. But here's this deadly disease, the disease that caused the death and deafness of Beethoven, 15 years later. That you could read this poem as if what it identified was that circumstance of a venereal disease that has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. It works only up to this point. His dark secret love does thy life destroy. You're then afoot again. You're not sure what this means. So that if you think you can now solve this problematic intentionality by pinning it down and saying this poem is just about the 1795 outbreak of syphilis in the city of London, then you would have missed something else that's going on in the poem. To look at the whole thing, everything in it becomes that kind of displaced intentional metaphor, where the state of experience that this poem is supposed to indicate, is that you start, with the experience of love, and you don't know what it may be afflicted by. That love may lead you into much darker and more damaging things than you'd ever expected. This is taking the joke of my opening example with a vengeance. The thorn now becomes something where the nature of love itself may be devouring, that it may be something that leads you into a form of dependency. It's that you might start off by saying, in the mood of Snoopy doing his happy little dance, "Oh, I'm in love, ain't that grand?" only to find out that it has another dimension, another side, and it's far darker. Now, in these poems that sometimes are treated as if they're poems suitable for children, only are so because people skate over the top of this problematic intentionality. Now, I put that as a subtitle for this, the violation of expectations, because this happens frequently, where we have used a word, we're familiar with a concept, it becomes for us a commonplace. And as a commonplace, we then stop thinking about all of the other things that are associated with it. So violating the expectation can then open up an arena for exploration, and the arguments then become much more serious. For William Blake, it led to a form of mythopoetic writing, where he basically undertakes to rewrite the book, the Bible, and in his own view, at last to get it right, and that turns into an unfinishable manuscript called the Four Zoas that he worked at for possibly 20 years, revising it, to see what are all of the things that follow from an active imagination looking at reality as a place in which this continual exploration of possibilities is the very nature of reality, that it is not confined and constrained to those simple propositions we can identify as the intention of a concept, that the world is alive. It's continually changing and growing, and it might very well startle us. It might fill us with joy, and we do not know at the outset of the journey which one we're going to go to. So this opens up a whole arena. If you wanted to pursue the study of Blake, there's certainly a lot to occupy you in doing so. Now, this is another one. This is the sort of thing that poets rely on constantly. And this is one of the reasons why I recommended to my graduate student that he not take on the philosophical study, of metaphor, because where it would lead him is to questions that are so radical about the nature of his own understanding of logic that he'd hardly know how to get out of the box. Now, this is the poem I mentioned before by Emily Dickinson. It's number 986. This is very well known, and I think it's worth mentioning just at the outset. By way of anecdote, I was asked by a former student to come and do a talk at a very fancy high school, a private high school where all the students are very well prepared. And basically, I think what Jeff wanted me to do was come in and just push the button and let Leroy talk. So I did, about this poem, only to realize that these 16 and 17-year-olds had read this poem diligently, carefully, meticulously, and only about 20% of them ever even identified what the animal was that was being talked about. Now, I'm putting it that way because we'll now, I put you all on notice here. Can you beat the 17-year-olds? A narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. You may have met him, did you not? His notice sudden is. The grass divides as with a comb, a spotted shaft is seen, and then it closes at your feet and opens further on. He likes a boggy acre, a floor too cool for corn, yet when a boy and barefoot, I more than once at noon have passed, I thought, a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. When stooping to secure it, it wrinkled and was gone. Several of nature's people I know and they know me. I feel for them a transport of cordiality, but never met this fellow attended or alone, without a tighter breathing and zero at the bone. Now, of course, what they've failed to notice is that this is about a snake. This is a snake in the grass. Now, what would this poem look like if you didn't notice that she's talking about the snake in the grass? It goes through the grass like a comb. You know, it stops and then divides further on. She is looking from the top down in a field of grass at a snake moving. And if all you see is what's the effect of the snake's motion on the grass moves. You know, the things that I have highlighted here is by no means exhaustive. This one is so rich because in almost every line here you will have some set of restrictions of your ordinary association that is violated. The narrow fellow who rides. You know, and since I already gave it away earlier, you see the point. The peculiar capitalization. Emily Dickinson frequently does large caps because I'm sure that's my phone. I didn't have the wit to turn it off. Her punctuation in this case is very significant because when him is capitalized in most English and American texts, it's a reference to the deity. So you then have the association with this snake, as with the serpent, designated in the conventional and certainly the puritanical form of the address to the Almighty, you know, to God. Now, down here, I thought I saw a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. So you have to visualize here a braided leather whip, you know, and watch the snake as if the whip were unbraiding. You know, it's very, very ingenious that she's able to see it that way. There is, just by way of commentary, a wonderful Chinese proverb which says, "A man bitten by a snake will fear a rope." Okay, so the fact that we look at the world in these ways is what Emily Dickinson, you know, is here relying on. Now, this changes the focus a little bit, because from all of these examples, you can see how in the ordinary routine of talking about poetry, you can just proceed and take these examples in small groups, in clusters, and then explicate the metaphor. Point out how it is that what the language allows us to do is to deal in a concrete, you know, and a relatively informal way with the huge extensionality, you know, the elaboration of the relations by which the world becomes you know, familiar to us. This diagram is something that I've been working on for some time, and in conjunction with work on the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, which is a way of trying to take this to a little higher level of specificity, you know, and to look at what kind of philosophical questions does the study of metaphor possibly raise. Now, this is a diagram that's probably easiest just to take you through this. In a moment, I'll stop so we can just go straight to questions. I want to just at least introduce this. That you know, this was something that I first began working on about 25 years ago in trying to get a representation, you know, of certain difficulties in handling relations between such putative states as the objective and the subjective. The distinction between objective and subjective is an old philosophical chestnut. I've come to think of it as perhaps the most damaging piece of nonsense in the entire philosophical history, because it leads us not to take into account the very kinds of relations that the study of metaphor foregrounds. Instead, what I wanted was a model that allows us to look at the production of meaning and our modes of understanding as always relying upon mediation, something that establishes a relation between one thing and another. So instead of thinking on this side, where I've got this P, this is something having to do with persons or with perceptions, instead of thinking of it as being this is subjective, to look at what happens whenever we identify anything we look at, that we can recognize between perception and cognition there is intimate linkage, but still the possibility of discriminating between the one and the other. It's just that you can't separate them. So if you think of a simple circumstance where you open your eyes and look out the window, in doing so, your perception that you can clearly enough identify processes what you see as a situation. When you first look out the window, you don't know exactly what it is you're looking at because you're seeing the entire backyard. But as you do so, you may then notice that that situation itself has a structure. It has, to use the grammatical term, an arrangement or a syntax. There is some gray object moving in the vicinity of a green object, and it turns out to be a squirrel about to go behind a bush. So you see this, but in order to make sense of that, we have to come back on this side, that what happens in your perception, as soon as you have seen there is some structure, it becomes not perceptual but cognitive. Now you're thinking, I see a squirrel going behind the rhododendron. But in so doing, you've completed the circuit between that syntax, what you've seen outside yourself, and your cognition, and it becomes then predication. That's a squirrel behind the rhododendron. Now you have all of the parts completed, and what then is possible is to go back through it. You can now focus your attention on what it is you've identified and say, now I will look at the squirrel. For the moment, I don't care a fig about a rhododendron. I'm tracking that squirrel. And then the process repeats over and over and over again. Now, in the mode of a thought experiment, this is a model that with a single input, and any situation rich enough to have a structure where you could hardly exhaust it. You can simply follow this around and around and around, getting more and more precision, more and more focus on particular things that happen. Now, this does not raise a problem of asserting in any way that there is some simplex truth out there in the world that we can find it. Even if we were Scott Mulder, former English major though he is, on his best day, the point of this is the truth is not out there. The truth has to be created through our predications. We find it through the relations that we manage and control as we're looking at the world. Now, this does make it possible in this model, to say that in what ordinarily happens, the grammar, of our process of thinking follows a very simple linguistic model of topic and comment. You identify a topic and then you make a comment about it. And in the terms that are sort of displayed or splayed at the top, how did we ever select what it was we would look at when we looked out the window? What are the things that we might pick out, as interesting to watch? There have been a number of somewhat tedious games, in our family that I think are really assented to by my children and by my wife as a mode of protection. As I'm driving, I'm constantly saying, look at that, look at that, look at that. So that they understand that when I start to do this and I'm gesturing off at the landscape, their task is to say, ooh, ah, so that I will keep my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. Okay? And now they know the ooh and ah response, but there's another element of this that I think it goes much broader, that as you look at the world around you and simply scan how fast and how quickly people can pick out objects, used to be a matter of serious training. If we were all still woodsmen, we would have to be able to spot that squirrel and to pick the squirrel out because that might be lunch. So our ability to identify objects has a huge weight of biological history, cultural history, and much else. So when we look at the world, what it is we actually see depends on whether or not we have the instruments to see how do we see relation. Because relation is something that we discover through such things as the study of metaphor that depicts or depends upon features of the world that we are strongly disinclined to notice spontaneously. I realize that was a terrible sentence, and I should spend some time unpacking it, but I'm just going to crash on forward for a minute. The point of that complicated sentence is really quite simple, and it is that we see when we look at the world what we're habituated to see, what we're accustomed to see, what we think we ought to see. So in many cases, what we're actually looking at escapes our attention altogether. On the campus of the University of Washington, it's like a glorious park. So it's a great place to walk around. And it's also a great place to walk around watching the students, watching the campus, or as it usually turns out, not watching, because they're on their way to class. When you get in your car in the morning, in one respect, you're already at your destination. You're thinking about what you're going to do that day. You're lining up your work in your mind so that you don't even notice what's on the road. You don't see what's there because you're already focused and moving directly. So that's how the students tend to walk. And I've been there now for 20 some odd years, and so I have a life of colossal leisure. And one day, standing in front of Miller Hall on the quad, I noticed something very, very peculiar, a crow. And the crow was digging and rummaging around in the newly cut grass. And so I stood just far enough away not to disturb the crow as he did his work. He had stolen somewhere about a quarter of a hamburger from the hub. Now, any of you familiar with the University of Washington hub know about those hamburgers. You don't want to save them at all. But this crow was taking the grass away and dropping the hamburger down in the grass and then covering it up with the grass. And as he finished, he straightens himself up like this, and he looks around this way, just bouncing, and then took off. And I thought, my God, what a thing I've just seen. Here's this crow whom I might be inclined to think is a stupid animal or a dumb animal or something. Who knows what I think about the crow, who has here looked to see whether there are any other crows who might be interested in a quarter of a hub hamburger, has hidden it and then covered it up and taken off. So that began a long process of watching the crows a lot more carefully than the students. And here's the next thing that I noticed. This just blew me away. On a road, a pathway where it is unpaved, that you just wait, let the students go like the deer. They will find the quickest way to get to Parrington Hall, for example. And I noticed that there was a crow perched on a limb above this pathway. And I noticed that he had something in his mouth. And I couldn't exactly make it out, and I realized that it was a twig. And he's watching down between his feet, looking down as the students walked. And a girl came along, moving fairly fast, and this crow dropped that stick, and missed her by about this much. It just went right down behind. And he jumps up and down and reaches over and takes another twig. He's got a whole stack of twigs lined up on the branch where he's standing to drop them, as projectiles, on the people. Okay, now this is where the study of metaphor becomes a direct instrument for the study of nature. Because the things that we don't notice, intelligent behavior among crows, then you start watching, thinking about the University of Washington campus. The faculty, of course, knows that they own it, and the students believe that it is theirs, and we're all wrong. It belongs to the crows. They're the ones who are really in control of the campus. But the advantage of a model like this, is that it allows, at least for a kind of compass, where are the kinds of relations that we need to watch? How did we select something? And we selected something based on our community and our history. So that the things that come into our attention first is we have to pick the ground of our perception. What are you going to focus your attention on? Now, any claims that you might then make about this depend on that history, and they enter into the shaping of your perception such that in the situation you focus not on the rhododendron but on the squirrel, or that you focus on the crow burying the hamburger and not the cut grass. Then all of our predications are within this circuit of mediation. Now, I've experimented to some degree with trying to formalize this to say that each of these instances here of identifying, structuring, predicating, processing, and selecting could be regarded in a kind of informal axiomatic way. These are mediating functions without which our mental life would cease. But they also turn out to be exactly what goes on in metaphor. And so instead of thinking of metaphor as something that poisons the mind, something that misleads people, something that is only for entertainment, it's come to seem much more to me like the logic of metaphor is the absolute foundation of logic. That what we do with our imagination in and through the relational instruments of metaphor lays the foundation and the groundwork for all of the much more specialized thinking we will do with the logic of propositions, with mathematics, with much more tightly controlled and really quite special cases. This I just included this, as at least a kind of final provocation before I quit here. That if you take seriously the idea of a devious logic of metaphor, then the philosophical questions that I would be willing to predict are going to come out to be not just on the horizon, but the very arena you're working with, are really fundamental problems of logic where logic impinges on metaphysics. What kind of a place is the world such that we can do the kinds of things we know we can do? Now, logic, depends on these three canons. And there's nothing new about this. All of these have been around since Aristotle's first astounding discovery of the syllogism, where we presume that these can be treated as if they were laws of thought. The law of contradiction, as for all propositions, P is impossible for both P and not P to be true. That seems to be unproblematic, and so we accept it. The law of the excluded middle. Either P or not P must be true. There's no third or middle true proposition between them. And finally, the principle of identity, that the thing is identical to itself. Now, in the mode of Blake and his contraries, the propositions here, is that this, the law of contradiction, is acceptable to us. We treat it as if it were a law, only because it presumes uniform intentionality. And therefore, it is not criteriological for truth. That is, you can't get a criterion for truth out of this, or for falsity, if the condition of uniform intentionality is not established. That is, do we have an adequate inventory of the attributes and aspects that make this thing what it is? Now, the way of treating this, so you don't give it up altogether and find yourself out there in the wilderness with Jacques Derrida and the postmodernists, is to say the law of contradiction actually functions, and it does an absolutely essential job, as a felicity condition for decisions. You will shape your logic to the point where you make a decision between this and this, where the judgment, truth and falsity, has a practical meaning, and not the theoretical meaning that Aristotle gave it when he first did the prior analytics. In the second case, the law of the excluded middle, this presupposes that the formation of predicates is either exhaustive or unproblematic. That is, when we say P or not P, do we know what intentional predicates there are in either? My argument is that we don't. This, once again, is a felicity condition. If you want to form predicates so that they will work in a logical system, you do so by selecting particular attributes and ignoring the dissonance. That is, this is where the objection to metaphor comes in. Because what a metaphor will do is show you why those predicates are problematic, why there are many more attributes and aspects of the words we use than we ordinarily would think. And finally, the principle of identity, here I guess I'm just playing around. This is a logical prejudice. It's deriving from an uncritical acceptance of 1 and 2, as if they were unproblematic. And it further assumes that the only mode of being is the being of a thing. So that these three, as things that have seemed to be the foundation, the very pillars, of logic, are themselves all dependent on the prior sorting that is done of a world of relation by the instrument of logic. Now, if I were going to be, in an academic context, completely utopian, what I would like to see, is contexts in which the study of metaphor and the study of logic was one study. And my interest in Charles Sanders Peirce is that is largely what Peirce actually did, but that it would then commit us, I think, to a really a vigorous and very exciting intellectual project, of trying to see how far we can go when we start to look at making explicit all of the things we simply didn't notice because we'd already fallen into the patterns, of our own society. So that's probably, I've used up too much time already. So I'll stop there. Do you have questions or matters you want to pursue?
So that last thing is like pulling the rug from under the feet, right?
I think it's also pulling the floor joists.
So where do you go?
Where do you go?
Down? Yeah, right.
Well, no. Now, you'll notice embedded in this messy diagram, is first, second, and third. Now, if any of you spend any time studying or reading Charles Sanders Peirce? A little? Okay. Peirce is the founder of pragmatism, the first person in English to use the word semiotic, and by I think anyone's count, one of the most original and profound philosophers in American literary history. I remember philosophical history. But Peirce has been extremely difficult. I've been involved for a number of years with some projects, of dealing with Peirce's manuscripts. And this is just a remarkable and tragic story that Peirce was identified very clearly by his contemporaries, including his friend William James, as the smartest person they'd ever met, and was enormously productive as a writer. He wrote something in the range of 150,000 pages. But the only full book he ever published was a U.S. coastal survey of geodetic research on gravitational attraction. And all the rest of it was done in the form of small memos, articles, and other things. So the published, writings of Peirce during his life amounted to about 40,000 pages, leaving 110,000 pages of manuscripts that had never been, published. Many of them still are not. It includes a dazzling piece of work on an entirely visual representation of the propositional calculus, which can be extended to handle modal logics in ways that just will make your hair tingle. Peirce, however, understood, as I think no one before him had quite so clearly, that how you study logic is not simply a question of how you study the calculus derived from logic, but that it is an actual reflection, of a metaphysic. And so his argument was, when you find that the rug has been pulled out from under you and the floor joist went with it, you might discover that you didn't need them to stand anyway, because the very revelation that might be made, and Peirce, of course, makes this over and over again, is that the world is a far stranger place than we think. Now, his argument is that the dominant philosophical history of the West has been grounded on Plato and Aristotle, and we have hardly made any progress. You know, that there are only two modes of existence, that is form and matter, however you parse them out, mind and body, or whatever way you do it. You know, and Peirce recognized that if you take a simple logical example from a sentence, and this is the sentence he used, A gives B to C, and try to explain how it is possible for us to apprehend that as unproblematic, simply cannot be solved with a two-value logic. You know, that you need a third term. And where it led him was to these explorations of saying that our thought is built up, you know, from those things that identify a ground for our attention, then our correlations as we look at them, and finally come to formulations of what he called an interpretant, or third. Abstract relations that are part of the nature of reality, and it's in their nature to be evolutionary and open-ended. So it's a very exciting project. It's just that this is one that you look at the timeline, and that's probably a 200-year project. You know, and I don't think I want to live that long. You know, but I want to be around long enough to see a little more progress with it. Yeah. No, yes.
So how does language fit in? And the idea that maybe language cannot always represent exactly what we're saying in the right level of detail. That as a tool, it may be limited.
Well, now I want to give two answers. In one respect, I think we all respond to the sense that language is limited, which is why we supplement it with devices. So the part of the question is, how would we regard the nature of language? And if we think of the nature of language as something that is already given, then that may be our first mistake. That if language is instead something that is devised, that we take as a device that allows us to devise other things, then metaphor becomes the first common sense instrument where you can expand the capability of what you thought the language could do. If you think that a word is simply the name of a thing, then it doesn't take into account all of the properties that you may have assimilated when you learned that word. When Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example, in the Philosophical Investigations, introduces that notion of the language game, we've tended, just in popular discussion of Wittgenstein, to treat it as if the game part is what's important, and don't look at the rest of what Wittgenstein said. And he says the reason that it can be played as a game is that as we learn forms of speech, we're learning forms of life. So you learn the word squirrel, but what you also learn is, what do squirrels do? What are their habits? You know, what are they associated with? What are they related to? You know, and Peirce was very, very good using a kind of philosopher's equivalent of linguistic intuition to find those cases in which the ability of two objects to be in a certain relation told you something about the object that you could not have inferred. I wish I had a good set of examples. My intuitions are not that well trained. But see, if we take metaphor and other devices, then language is not limited, because it's like the ultimate all-purpose toolkit. You can build the tool that you need to take the next step. You know, and for Peirce, the reason for going to a three-value logic instead of two, you know, is, are you able at any point in the process of your thinking to reverse your field and say, can I get from this proposition back to the evidence for it? You know, and if we find then that one idea depends upon some other idea, we may be in for a long process. But we could then look at it and say, if we have made a mistake in the things we've devised that allowed us to think certain thoughts, we can find our way back to where we made the mistake and correct it. We do it intuitively. You know, and part of my interest in such questions as metaphor is include them within the entire inventory of our tools, and language does not then seem limited at all. You know, the problem is our limits on our imagination. can we devise a tool with the instrument we already have that will allow us then to take that next step? Yes?
Two quick questions. So in psychology, they sometimes do priming experiments where they'll show an ambiguous picture, like a picture that could be an old woman or a young woman, depending on how you look at it. And they'll first prior show either a picture of a separate old woman or a separate young woman. And depending if you show the old woman or the young woman first, depends on how you see the second image. And they can, they do studies and have statistics around it. Do they do anything like that with metaphors?
Well, I think in a practical sense, you do it every time you teach a poem, because one of the things that I've gotten acquainted and familiar with this, but I've never gotten used to it. That when I go in to teach a class on material that I've had, maybe 20 or 30 years to read and reread and think about and so on, that we'll start talking about a poem, and the students who have very good reason to think of themselves as clever and smart, find themselves feeling stupider and stupider. Is this a familiar experience for you? You'd say, how could I have read that and missed all of it? Because after it's pointed out, it's so obvious. It's right there. How could I have gone off fishing for this symbol when all I needed to do is literalize the actual image that was there? And what I can't get used to, is the difficulty of that as a kind of learning. And the reason is just exactly what you're talking about. You fix on one thing, and that provides the template for how you will see the next thing. And it really requires discipline not to let that happen. I think one of the most interesting psychological experiments of that sort, is one that was done at Harvard, and it was very instrumental for Thomas Kuhn in developing the structure of his argument, structure of scientific revolutions. This was a case where the psychologist named Miller, they did a study with college sophomores, and they would show them playing cards, and they'd turn them over, and then they'd have to identify them. They just get one quick look. And what they had done is to insert into the deck some ringers, cards that are like, a red 2 of spades, a black jack of diamonds, and then there'd be a number of them. They'd just go through, and most of the students never got it. If they didn't get it, all the ones who didn't get it tended to get headaches. Because they knew something was wrong, they can't figure it out because they're expecting to see that if it's in if it looks like a spade, it should be black. A red 2 of spades, it's an anomaly. So the issue there is just to call attention to the fact just how important these elements are of our histories and our communities. Even if it's on the short term, we're set up to see exactly what we're prepared to see. Yeah.
So under your proposal, is the combination of topic and comment sort of your paradigm?
I guess so. I sometimes think of it as a machine which, if I could automate and do in brass and springs and leather and other stuff, it would be something that I would want to make dance. But yes.
So is sharing and then acceptance of those assumptions implicit in that? Is that really how, right, in the sense that you might shift thinking to a new paradigm, it's really getting folks to accept that as a point of view?
Yeah, I guess so. I have the suspicion that I may not be disciplined enough to be the one to do that. I have too much fun. But so one of the things that I would want to claim about this, is that because it shifts the attention to mediation and does not treat the model, the problem of meaning directly, that you then have a level of detail for identifying specific relations. So that if you just shifted to another metaphor, to another paradigm, it might not necessarily make anything better. Suppose you have, just to use a mechanical example, you've got someone where they've got a certain difficulty with something, and you say, well, the problem is your perspective. You have a fixed perspective on this, and the phenomenon is flying through the perspective so you can't see it. And they say, oh, very well. I will re-engineer my perspective, shift it over 15 degrees, and put the bolt right back in. So that what you want is, can we get this so that it is flexible enough to work by gyroscope? So that you don't end up fixating, on these things, but recognize that just as this could be treated as a kind of Markov process, it just circles around and around. Each iteration will change. The result that comes out of the end, you plug it back in, and something will change. That it's not just that. It's a device for criticism. You can say, well, let's stop and see what exactly were we doing when we're looking at this situation. What structures did we find out? And then each of these might be, because as you will notice, they're all metaphors, things where we'd specify more and more attributes, more and more specificity. Yes?
Is there such a thing as analytic pragmatism?
Well, I think there is, but I'm not sure that anybody who's used that term, when Peirce, it's one of the reasons why I'm entirely with Walker Percy, who famously said, when somebody asked him after a Library of Congress lecture, who is this Charles Sanders Peirce? I've never heard of them. And Walker Percy said, you will. I think everybody will. Peirce, had as a student John Dewey, and he treated Dewey, in not only letters and comments but reviews, with absolutely ruthless, even scathing contempt for being such a bad logician. And unfortunately, Peirce was dead on. When he was invited late in his life to give a series of lectures at Harvard by William James, who had actually stolen the word from Peirce to write his book on pragmatism, he invites Peirce to come and do these lectures at Harvard, and what he spends his first 2 complete lectures on is explaining why the announcement written by William James was such a load of bullshit. Now, Peirce did not do very well at winning friends and influencing people, because he took that view. But his own response was then to say, I guess I better call what I do something else. And so he called it pragmatism, saying very wittily, that is a word ugly enough to be safe from the kidnappers. Because Peirce's pragmatism already was analytic. I mean, it's analytic with a vengeance. I mean, he's very hard to read. Partly because he really is so analytic. But it also illustrates, coming back to your earlier point about the issue of paradigms, if we're not in a community where we speak in the same way that other people do, if when you talk somebody doesn't understand you, then all sorts of goofy things happen to you. And that was the greatest lack for Peirce, that he did not have colleagues, who would correct him and say, this is a brilliant idea, but you may have made a choice here that would be more felicitously made if you'd gone somewhere else. I'm very heartened by the fact that the interest in Peirce continues to grow. And so my guess is that if you went out and did a Google search for analytical pragmatism, you'd probably find it. I haven't done it, so.
Maybe one more question, or we'll go ahead and wrap up and folks can ask questions one-on-one after. Thank you very much for coming.
There's one more. Can we still get time for it?
Okay, so you talked a little bit about how the core problem of metaphors, I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, is how do I convey the intended similarities and how do I restrict the unintentional similarities in a metaphor? And you talked one way about doing it, which is using 2 metaphors together to the same object, which kind of you can eliminate the dissimilarities between the 2 metaphors. We talked about a little bit about that with Burke.
Yeah.
Are there other techniques like that we could look at that?
Absolutely. But to sometimes these remain below the horizon of public visibility because they're just techniques that people use. I'll just give you one illustration. If you're working with a literary text where you have the one instance of a constraint on what would be appropriate as an interpretive position, it can be at the level of the figures. But there are also instances in which you may have, for example, structural properties of an overall work where you have to be able to make inferences about that larger level of structure. Now, still, in the teaching of reading, it is referred to among child psychologists as the reading trauma. Because when the child learns to read, it's a severe restriction on what they already know how to do very well. And part of that trauma involves in channelizing your attention to that ongoing stream of signifiers. And it might as well, be, as Jacques Derrida says, infinite. And it's very, very difficult then to get outside of it so that you can see the whole thing. I'll give you a quick illustration. In the play that I've taught perhaps more frequently than any other, Shakespeare's The Tempest, there are structural features that are so remarkable that, in the something like 2,000 critical articles that I have checked on this, nobody has ever picked this up. That in the structure of the setup for The Tempest, is this familiar to all of you? This is part of your college background? That you have Prospero, the Duke of Milan, has been displaced by his brother, working in concert with the brother of the King of Naples, who has just gone, to the African coast, Tunis, to marry off his daughter Claribel. Now that's in the background of it, and nobody gets the map out and draws the map. From Milan up in the Alps, that was the only pathway to Europe. The reason you don't go, or didn't go in the 16th century, to Europe by way of northern Italy, is because the Alps come all the way down into the ocean. And there is no bay, on this French coast. So you wonder why Hannibal took his elephants through the Alps? That's the only way to go. There's Milan. Naples is just south of Rome. And put it on Tunis and draw the triangle. Y'all see this? What Alonso, the King of Naples, has done is to set up a political network that would have given him control of the whole world. He'd have had it all. And Shakespeare does this without ever calling attention to the fact, saying, I've set this play that so you will understand that all of this is happening in a huge power move where somebody has sacrificed his entire family to try to get political hegemony in the Mediterranean. Now if that weren't enough, then you look at the play itself and you find that Shakespeare never wrote his plays Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. That's a French invention. They were trying to follow Aristotle's idea of the unities. He just did them scene by scene. In The Tempest, there are exactly 9 scenes. And the way the play unfolds is everything that happens in the first scene is not resolved until the 9th scene. Everything that happens in the second scene is not resolved until the 8th scene. And you have this pyramid structure. It's a perfect frame tale. And right in the middle of this, you have the shortest or next to shortest scene of the entire play, which is a scene between Ferdinand and Miranda, the son of King Alonso and the daughter of Prospero, the rightful Duke of Milan. And the scene itself is so puzzling and so bizarre, because what happens is Miranda, who has her whole identity has been shaped by the attempted rape, by Caliban, comes on the beach to find that Ferdinand is doing Caliban's work. He's carrying logs. And she is so turned on by this guy, I'm not exaggerating here, she wants to jump his bones right on the beach. And it's all done in the form of this very decorous metaphysical conceit, as she talks about, oh, I would die to give what I hope to, and all she's really doing, to put it in really crude terms, is to say, Ferdinand, you really turned me on. I don't think I can wait to marry you. Let's get it on right here on the beach. Now, if you look at this structure, almost every reader will miss it. You'll zip right through, that central scene, scene 5, and not even notice what Shakespeare has done. That he's put that as the central point. There are dozens of others. We don't, when we read, we don't, when we think, usually have the diagrammatic means to make explicit all of those structural things that affect our inferences. They're not part of our regular procedures. If somebody does it, they do it because they learned how. It's like a trick. But so if we were to say, expand it in that direction, then this model of mediation would say, we really do need to seriously, seriously take another look at what we mean by reasoning. That it's much bigger than we thought it was. Now I've really gone over. Thank you very much.